Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to Do Station with yet another video. I hope you are good, you are enjoying and learning as well, and my efforts are helping you guys. So we are covering our module 4, which is hazard identification and risk assessment process. We call it HIRA. So in the today's video, we will cover very important topics which are related to the legislations first. So we will see the key legislations and regulations that govern the risk assessment process and set the principles for effective risk assessment. And then we will look into the basic definitions related to the risk assessment, and we will understand what are the vulnerable groups and what are the special considerations that we have to take for these vulnerable groups in the risk assessment process. So very interesting topics today we are going to cover. So let's start our video and learn them. Welcome to presentation everyone. We are covering our module hazard identification and risk assessment process HIRA, in which we are understanding the implementation of the risk assessment. This is part 3. Let's look into the module guide. Our module is hazard identification and risk assessment HIRA process, which is a systematic process to identify hazards, evaluating the associated risk, and then implementing the suitable control measures so we can ensure our health and safety standards are effective. So we are in this module we are learning this process. The key topic we will cover today are risk assessment and the legal requirements in the specific law. We will look into legal criteria to be met as per the laws. Then what is the law enforcement, how it works. Then key risk assessment definitions we will understand today, and then we will look into the considerations for the vulnerable people. Learning outcomes. So by the end of the module, we will be able to understand. We will have a good understanding of the legal requirements or that organization must meet to comply with the legal requirements. Then some specific regulations that which govern the risk assessment process. Then we will have a good understanding of the about the considerations that we take in the risk assessment process for the vulnerable peoples. Then we will have a good understanding of the critical identification, important definitions related to the risk assessment process. Introduction of today's topic, we are covering our HIRA module. Today we will look into the legal requirements, legal obligations that organization must meet when doing a risk assessment, and also we will look into the some specific regulations that govern the risk assessment process. Also, we will look into the considerations that we have to take for the vulnerable people, and then some key definitions which are important in the risk assessment process. Risk assessment and legal requirements. Legal requirements are basically legislations and regulations that organizations must comply with them. So let's look into some risk assessment specific legislations and regulations that govern the risk assessment process. The first law that addresses risk assessment is the Health and Safety at Work (ETC) Act 1974. That gives a principle as far as is reasonably practicable and bound the employer to provide a safe place of work. Then the next law is the Management of Health and Safety Work Regulations that addresses the risk assessment and bound the employer to ensure that all the risk assessments are suitable and sufficient. We explain this concept in the later part of the module. Let's look into some risk assessment specific regulations. Manual handling operations related to the manual handling and sets the principle for the risk assessment about the regarding manual handling. Then personal protective equipment regulations which set the principle for the risk assessment specific to the personal protective equipment. Then health and safety display screen equipment regulations which address the issues related to the display screen and sets the risk assessment process. Then control of noise at work regulation address the noise issues and then also give the criteria and principle for the risk assessment. Then control of substances hazardous to health regulations address the hazardous substances and give the risk assessment criteria. Then regulatory reform fire safety order basically looks into the fire related matters and sets the risk assessment principle. So now let's look at some principles that these legislations set for the risk assessment process. The first one is so far as is reasonably practicable, in which we are weighing up the risk and consequences against the cost, time, and effort we have to put. So let's take a control, then we compare its benefits against the time, cost, and effort. If benefits outweigh the time, cost, and effort, then we select it. Otherwise, we'll go for some another control measure. So this way we balance the both the risk and consequences against the time, cost, and effort, and then we select which control measure is suitable for us. Then the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999 basically describe the importance of risk assessment. It says that risk assessment is a cornerstone of the health and safety legislation and is absolutely essential to safe work environment. So this way they emphasize the importance of risk assessment. Law enforcement, how it works, the regulatory bodies inspector can inspect any organization. If they find some minor issues, they give you the informal advice during the inspection to improve your risk assessment or control. At the end of the inspection, they give you some formal letter in writing, formal advice and suggestions to improve your risk assessment and control. Then they can serve an improvement notice if they find there is a likelihood that injury can happen and that there is no control measure. So they can give you the deadline during which you have to improve the condition. Then they can serve a prohibition notice if some activity or situation is very high, critically high, and there is a high risk of severe consequences. Then they can even stop your whole activity and until you take the remedial actions and improve the situation. And also, if they find that you are breaching some law, there is some violation of the legal regulation, then they can take to the court. And if in the court it is found that you are breaching the law, you breached some law or legislation, then there may be the consequences like imprisonment up to 2 years or the very heavy fine, which are unlimited. Now let's look into some key risk assessment definitions and define the key terminologies. The first definition is hazard. Something with potential to cause harm. Any source of the potential harm is called hazard. They may be the articles you are preparing, your product, substances you are dealing with, people involved with your business. Then plant, machinery, equipment are a potential source of the harm. Then work methods may be incorrect or unsafe. Then work environment conditions like air quality, then temperature, very cold or very hot. So all these things, anything that can cause harm is called hazard. Next is the risk, that is the likelihood of harm from the hazard and its potential severity. We know that risk is the property of hazard, have two emerging correct factors, likelihood and consequences, which vary as the conditions change. So the level or the severity, extent of the risk depends on few factors, which is likelihood. High the likelihood, high will be the risk. Similarly, consequences. If the severity is high, the level of the risk will be high. Then the number of people who may be exposed to the hazard increases the extent or the level of the risk. Then the scale of the property or the business that can be affected. Then the scale of the environment. So these are few factors that impact on the level of the risk. Next term is risk control hierarchy, another legal term, comes from the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations in 1999. It sets the principle for the effective control measure. It suggests to follow the hierarchy of control that we will cover in the later sections of the module. Suggests to recommend to conduct the risk assessment. It recommends to adopt the combination of the controls, rather single or individual control. Then control the risk at its source so it will be more effective. And recommend to use the technical controls rather the control that rely on the people. Give the priority to collective protection rather than individual protection measures. It suggests that reliance on the people should be as low as possible, as those controls who rely on the people are usually less effective. Next term is suitable and sufficient risk assessment. A legal term we already discussed in previous video under the fundamental concept in HSE. So here we briefly discuss it again. So basically this is a legal term linked to the another legal term, reasonably foreseeable. So by the law we are bound to identify all the reasonably foreseeable risks and reduce or control them to as far as is reasonably practicable level. So which risks are reasonably foreseeable? So criteria by the law is that the risk that comes under the common knowledge, legal knowledge, expert knowledge, industry knowledge are the reasonably foreseeable risks. And all those risks that come meet this criteria must be controlled to the as far as is reasonably practicable level. Then how we achieve them? We achieve them by conducting a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. So a suitable and sufficient risk assessment is a risk assessment that covers all the reasonably foreseeable risks and control them to as far as is reasonably practicable is called a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. So there are some other properties. This is dynamic risk assessment basically that as the conditions change, we know that the new hazards emerge. So this risk assessment is dynamic in nature, readily modify itself and cover those new changes
and address them, and then becomes valid again. So such a risk assessment is called suitable and sufficient risk assessment. Competent person, appropriate skills, knowledge, and experience. A competent person is a person who has sufficient relevant knowledge and skills and abilities to apply this knowledge effectively, and then have a sufficient experience along with the good communication skills and risk perception level. In the broader context, a competent person is basically the person who has a good understanding about the processes and activities of the organization and the circumstances, conditions, and situations that may lead to the hazardous situations, and he also understands how these situations, conditions, or circumstances may emerge and how to effectively control them. Such a person is basically the competent person. Next is a consideration for the vulnerable during the risk assessment process. First group of vulnerable are the young people. Anyone under the 18-year age is a young person. And these people basically are very prone to the hazards and risks because they lack the experience, they don't have experience, they lack the awareness, they don't have good understanding of the work activities or the processes, especially the critical one. Also, they don't have a good understanding how the situations or circumstances can change and deviate to the hazardous situations. So they can harm themselves or they harm other people. So for such people, we have to take special considerations like we have to set the criteria which equipment they can use or which equipment they cannot use. Similarly, which processes or the jobs they can be assigned, and which trainings they need to improve their competency levels. Also, the level of the supervision they need. Also, how to control their exposure to the critical activities like their exposure to the hazardous substances. So, all these things regarding the young person we have to consider in the risk assessment process. Next vulnerable group is expected mother. We have to take special considerations in the risk assessment for the specific risks that can harm the expectant mothers and their babies, like the heavy loads. We have to take consideration for the standing for long periods of time, long working hours, the hazardous substances like lead exposure to these, then exposure to infectious diseases and posture there during the job, then night shifts. So these are some considerations we have to take to ensure that the health of the baby and mother are protected. If during the risk assessment we find that some risks are not avoidable or cannot be controlled, so then we have to change the work conditions, like work hours we have to change, or we have to give them the maternity leave, which are paid leave. So such considerations for the expectant mothers we have to take. The next vulnerable group are special people have mental, physical, or sensory impairments that may impact their ability to perform their job safely. These people are very prone, especially during the emergency situations. So we have to take special considerations like accessibility, emergency escape routes, special facilities, so they can evacuate safely in case of any emergency. Then maybe they need some special communication methods or means like sign languages or audio alarm. Then we have to maybe we have to consider their job roles which are suitable for them. Then specific training they may require like disability awareness about the welfare and communication means. And then maybe they need some thing regarding the ERP assistant like wheelchair, walkers, buddy system, or communication beam. So such thing that can assist the vulnerable people. We have to take considerations for such thing in the risk assessment process. We covered our today's topic. Let's conclude them. So, risk assessment and legal requirement. Risk assessment is a legal requirement. Then we looked into the specific laws that govern the risk assessment process. Then we looked into some principles that legislation give to us regarding the risk assessment, like as far as is reasonably practicable and suitable and sufficient risk assessment. Then we looked into the law enforcement, how law works. Then we defined some key terminologies which are very critical or important in the risk assessment process. Then we look into the special considerations that we have to take for the vulnerable people like young people, expectant mothers, and the special people. So that was it for today. I hope this will be helpful for you. Thank you for watching and supporting me. So see you in the next video with the next topic. Until then, take care, stay safe and healthy. Allah Hafiz.